This week, we're going to talk about generating excitement for your classroom. The best way to make sure that students stay engaged is to make sure that they're excited for what you're going to teach. So, does anybody recognize this clip right here?
Adams.
Here.
Adamley.
Here.
Adamowski. Adamson.
Here.
Adler.
Here.
Anderson. Anderson.
Here.
Bueller. 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 Bueller.
He's sick. My best friend's sister's boyfriend's brother's girlfriend heard from this guy who knows this kid is going with the girl who saw Ferris pass out at 31 Flavors last night. I guess it's pretty serious.
Thank you, Simone.
No problem whatsoever.
Fry. Fry. In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the, anyone? The Great Depression, passed the, anyone? A tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which, anyone raised or lowered? Raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government. Did it work? Anyone? Anyone know the effects? It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression. Today, we have a similar debate over this. Anyone know what this is, class? Anyone? Anyone? Anyone seen this before? The Laffer curve. Anyone know what this says? It says that at this point on the revenue curve, you will get exactly the same amount of revenue as at this point. This is very controversial. Does anyone know what Vice President Bush called this in 1980? Anyone? Something DOO economics. Voodoo economics.
Now, to say that this man is boring would be an accurate statement. But one of the things that I see that he does that is maybe even worse than just having that monotone voice is the fact that he doesn't allow time for students to be able to answer his question. So it takes about 7 seconds for students to process the question that you're asking and then form a response. So waiting 7 seconds is very important. I know that it seems like an eternity, and I used to count it off in my head, but you will find that students are more likely to engage with you and answer your questions if you give them that little bit of processing time. He, in this clip, continues to say the answer right after he asks the question, not allowing, number one, his students time to process it, but number two, they've probably been in this class for a while and understand that he doesn't really want their answer. He's just asking a question so that he can move on to the next point. Do you guys remember the Big Six? These are the things that impact a college career and retention of students the most. So one of them is professors who make students feel excited about learning. We really want to make sure that our students are excited about what we're teaching them, even if it's not something that they necessarily thought they were going to be excited about. What captures our students' attention can be varied. It could be humor, it could be emotion, it could be visual imagery, sound, movement, mystery. All these things can cause our students to become more engaged and more interested in what we're talking about. The first principle of engagement is emotional connection. How do we form that emotional connection, and why is it important that we form that emotional connection? When we start our instruction with an emotional hook, we find that our students become more interested in what we're teaching them. So it could be a funny meme, a controversial statement, a brief video. All these things are ways to hook our students emotionally so that they'll become more invested in our lesson. You can think of it as kind of like a trailer for your lesson. A good trailer, like the one I'm about to show you, gives you enough information that you're interested, but it doesn't give away everything. And it hooks you emotionally. So in this particular trailer, from the moment that the very first universal sign comes up, you already know what it is and you are already emotionally invested in it.
Welcome to Jurassic Park.
We've made living biological attractions so astounding that they'll capture the imagination of the entire planet.
The most phenomenal discovery of our time
How'd you do this?
becomes the greatest adventure of all time.
Can I touch it?
Sure.
Universal Pictures presents
You feel that?
Hold on to your butts.
a Steven Spielberg film.
Fences are failing all over the park.
Yeah, that's nice. Gotta go.
An adventure
I can't get Jurassic Park back online.
65 million years in the making. Jurassic Park.
That's what we want with our lessons, is for our students to become hooked into our lesson. Another way to make sure that our students are emotionally invested is relevance and meaning. All of our assignments and activities should have relevance and meaning. It should be relevant to what they're going to do in their career, or how to improve their community, or some sort of higher purpose. When I was teaching biology, not all of my students were excited to be there because most of them were non-majors. But once I started applying and giving relevance to the things that I was talking about, so for example, genetics isn't necessarily something that they're particularly interested in. But when I started talking about Charles II of Spain or Queen Victoria and hemophilia, they immediately became hooked. And I would tell them, this is relevant because if you have a genetic disease that you pass down, understanding how it gets passed down is important for you to understand the health of your future children. Humor is another way that we can engage with our students and make them excited about our particular subject. I used to use memes almost every lecture. I always gave mini lectures, so we would have one meme that would start it and probably one in the middle. Not everyone's a comedian, and that's fine, but using memes and funny videos are a great way to be able to inject humor into your lecture and allow your students to have that moment of levity and connection. Novelty is another way to spark interest into our class. So if you always lecture first, maybe move the lecture to the end. Or if you're always holding class indoors, try outdoors. I used to do this with my students when we would cover plants in the taxonomical groups. And we would go outside and we would find plants that would go ahead and be able to be seen, and so that they could find these things that lined up so that they could put things into categories. And it really made them excited about coming to class that day.
Thou seest we are not all alone unhappy. This wide and universal theatre presents more woeful pageants than the scene wherein we play in.
All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts.
The second principle of engagement is performance. So performance matters. Now, that's not to say that we are there to entertain our students, but we are always on display when we're up front and we're lecturing or we're giving instruction. So understanding that we are performers is paramount to getting our students to be engaged in our learning. I don't know if you've ever been on Rate My Professor before, but your students can go on there and give information to other students about how the professor's class works. As you can see from these particular comments, they like this professor as a human, but his class is always so boring. When we are always boring, our students aren't going to want to come to our classroom. They're not going to be excited and invested in learning our material. In all fairness, that professor also had some really positive comments, but our criticisms remind us that reality is whatever is perceived by the student. So if they perceive you to be boring and they perceive you to be non-engaging, that's their reality. So we have to be able to show our students that we have a side that can generate this excitement. If we're enthusiastic and expressive, we can draw our students in and make them more engaged with our material. Now, there's a difference between engagement and entertainment. We're not there to put on a dog and pony show. We are there to present this knowledge and help our students to grasp the understanding of this knowledge. So it's not about entertainment, but you can be entertaining. Students learn best when they are engaged in your class and when they are awake. So making sure that you vary your tone of voice and that you interject things that help them to stay awake and be active will increase their retention. The third principle of engagement is social connection. Building that connection with your students is what's going to keep them coming back to your class. Using their name, using culturally diverse examples. I have to say that one of my favorite things about teaching middle school where I taught was that my classroom was so diverse. But the subject that I taught is not particularly diverse. If you look through science books, most of the people who are in those books are male and white. So I wanted to show my students that there were other people out there who were successful in the scientific field that looked like them. And that's where Skype a Scientist came in. I was able to connect with a scientist who looked like my students and who came from a similar background as my students so that they could talk to my students about what their scientific research was, but also so that my students could see that there was somebody who looked like them in their field. Also, providing opportunities for collaboration, not only with their peers, but with you, will allow you to build that social connection. Varying your teaching strategies, so not always lecturing, but also not always doing the same thing over and over again. And promoting access and equity is of utmost importance. The fourth and final engagement principle is storytelling. Our brains love stories, and sharing those personal anecdotes and stories really helps build a connection with your material. My students, when we would study DNA, I would tell them about Rosalind Franklin and how she actually discovered the shape of DNA, but it was stolen from her by Watson and Crick. And so they would understand through that story the importance of the structure of DNA. And so that would allow them to be more engaged with that material and more excited about learning it. Stories help us to process and retain information. So when we are looking at providing our students this information, think of it in terms of like transferring an oral history. For thousands and thousands of years, we didn't have a written language, but there were still stories that were told over and over and passed on, and we were able to continue to make arrowheads and spears and jewelry and different arts because this information was passed on orally through stories. This is just like today. Even though we have all of the technological advantages and we have all of these things, our brains still love stories. Don't forget that when you're in the classroom, you're the star. Your enthusiasm for your topic and your passion for your particular discipline is what's going to keep students coming back to your classroom and keep them engaged in your material. When you demonstrate that, that's contagious. They may not have thought that they wanted to learn British literature or biology or physics or college algebra, but once they become more invested in you and in your topic, they will definitely become more engaged and more likely to retain that information over a longer period of time. So if you have any questions about anything that we've talked about today in terms of generating excitement, let me know. Call me. I'll come to your office. You can come to my office. Whatever you need, I'm here to help.